to our Center for Security Policy special briefing on a very important issue involving one of our most important allies, the State of Israel, and a very dramatic controversy that has been swirling in Israel for some time, but has come to a head with the election of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his governing coalition acting upon a mandate that they sought and received from the people of Israel to effect, among other things, judicial reform in that country in the wake of decades now of a Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice, as it's known, that has been more or less a rogue element, arrogating unto itself powers of the executive branch, of the legislative branch, not just in matters of law, but in matters of policy as well. The implications of that have been profound for Israel, and both its new government and the people who elected it have sought a corrective. And we're going to begin our conversation about the reason for that corrective being needed, the efforts that the Netanyahu coalition is making to bring them about, and the kind of resistance that they are facing now inside Israel, and the implications of all of this for most especially the State of Israel and its people, but also for those who revere and value our partnership with that country. We'll begin this program with Carolyn Glick. She is a senior fellow, I'm proud to say, with our Center for Security Policy, the host of a terrific podcast, The Carolyn Glick Show, the author of a number of books, including Shackled Warrior and the Israeli Solution. She is a contributor to Channel 14 in Israel and also a columnist for the Jewish News Syndicate. A woman of many parts, among them her service in the office of the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, during one of his previous incarnations. Her service as well in the Israel Defense Forces is noteworthy too. We're delighted always to have her with us and to essentially lay out what is going on with respect to judicial reform, the need for it, and its prospects. I'm very pleased to welcome back Carolyn Glick. Over to you, ma'am.
Thanks so much, Frank. Thanks for doing this podcast or this webcast. It's very important, or webinar, whatever we're calling them. Actually, Dave was nice enough to do the Carolyn Glick Show with me this week, and we're also talked about this issue among others. So if you want more information after you've watched this webinar, feel free to go to my website, the carolynglick.com, and you'll be able to find it. But just to give a sense, first of all, what is the judicial reform package that everybody's talking about and saying this is the end of democracy in Israel? And Tony Blinken was here, Secretary of State in Israel last week, and he was giving us a lecture about how best to conduct significant changes in the legal regime of a country. And he says it's very important to do a consensus, which is interesting coming from a senior Biden administration official, because, of course, since the Obama days, the Democratic Party hasn't looked for consensus or even bipartisan support for their major initiatives. But aside from the hypocrisy, it was also clear that he and Emmanuel Macron, who met with Prime Minister Netanyahu during his official visit over the weekend, were very keen to make clear that they weren't so happy with this judicial reform and acted like it was a major and dramatic thing. So just before we even start talking about whether it is dramatic or why it's causing this big fuss home, and first and foremost here at home, but also internationally, the judicial reform package that's now being pushed through the Knesset by the government and the coalition inside of the Knesset has 4 key points to it. The first one is that they want to change the way that justices are selected in Israel for the Supreme Court and for our lower courts, our magistrates' courts, and our district courts. And we have this very weird process that seems utterly crazy to most Americans, and reasonably they think this because it's very complicated. And basically, we have right now a committee that whose members decide. They have all their deliberations behind closed doors. They're completely impenetrable by the public. Nobody knows what's going on. The horse trading that goes on inside. And the most important thing about the committee that chooses all of the judicial appointments from the lower courts to the Supreme Court is that the Supreme Court justices control the selection process. They have an automatic majority of 5 out of 9 members of the committee at all times, and sometimes they have 7 or 8, but they control the committee completely. They have an automatic majority for all of their appointments, and they also, you need to veto somebody, you need 2 people, and they always have veto power over all the right-wing government appointments for all 3 levels of our courts in Israel. So that the selection process for our judges today on all levels is controlled by the Supreme Court. They choose themselves, and as a result, they are a self-perpetuating judicial branch whose members all accept certain shared values and shared concepts of law. They're all very, very far to the left, not all of them, but even the conservative members of the court have to be accepted by the more left-wing justices who control the selections process. So even the ostensible conservatives share the judicial-centric view of the court and the idea that its powers should be effectively limitless and unbalanced or checked by the Knesset or by the government. So the first move in this reform package is to change the way that justices are selected, change the automatic majority from the judges to the politicians and specifically to the government. So then under the proposed change, the government would actually have a majority on the committee so that it would be able to actually appoint justices. And then you would have a rotating thing like you have in the United States, where when you have a government of the left, then they would appoint leftist judges. When you have a government of the right, it would appoint rightist judges. So the concept is that over time you would have a balance and you would have a court system that would look more like the Israeli Israeli society than it does today, when it doesn't at all look like Israeli society. The second aspect to it is that our justice is arrogated, as Frank said at the outset, the powers of the Knesset to legislate laws, and also the power of the government to set policies and enact them. And so not only do they abrogate laws, the power that they seized for themselves, they don't have it under law, but they now even dictate what's supposed to be in laws. So it's not just that they cancel laws that the Knesset pass, but they also tell the Knesset what it has to pass in future legislation, which is, I don't think that there's a precedent for that in the world. And they also intervene in real time in government policy decisions and even in military and counterterrorism decisions in real time as the operations are going on. To stop operations in the middle if somebody petitions the court, and they immediately accept the petition, and then they overrule the decisions of the commander, which is in the field, which is pretty extreme. So they do this not on the basis of law, but they've invented these ideals about how they should do it. And so they have one that's called reasonableness. So if the justices decide that something is reasonable, then they'll allow it to stand. And if they decide that it's unreasonable, then they'll overturn it, whether it's a policy or a law or whatever. And that means that their judgments are not actually legal judgments, they're value judgments, but they have the force of law and they're binding. So the second aspect of the reform is that they want to cancel reasonableness as as a justification for judicial action. Now, what they want to do going forward is to limit the judicial purview to overturning laws or what have you, that it has to actually be based on a law, which seems reasonable to outsiders, but it is not the situation in Israel today. And the reform package would have that become possible. And the third thing that also has to do with judicial power is that right now, if the justices overturn a law or a government policy for that matter, they have no recourse. That the decision is final. So the judicial reform package also includes a provision for limiting the kinds of for overriding the override, canceling, abrogating the override, re-legislating a law that has been overridden by the Supreme Court, and how the Supreme Court needs to override laws. It needs to have an absolute majority or unanimous consent of the justices. It needs to be a full panel of all 15 justices. It can't be a three-judge panel, and so on and so forth. So it puts limits on how they can overturn laws, and it also gives the Knesset the means to overturn judgments overturning laws. And then the final aspect, the final part of the reform package that's currently being put forward in Knesset is that right now we have an attorney general who acts as a super executive. And so the attorney general can say that a prime minister isn't allowed to serve. He can fire ministers, say that they can't serve. He can say that a policy is illegal and therefore the government can have it. He can refuse to represent the government before the Supreme Court, and then the government is left without recourse. So if it's sued, it can't defend itself because the legal advisor or the attorney general feels that the government is wrong, and therefore the government has no representation when it's sued in the courts, among other things. So the fourth provision is actually very limited. It just says that the legal advisor to the government, the attorney general, that his legal decisions or his legal opinions are just that, they're opinions, and they're not binding on the government, and the government can override the decision of the attorney general and can hire. It doesn't even talk about firing them, but that they can hire another attorney to represent them and to disregard the legal advisor. So those are the four things that are now. This is supposed to be phase one, and then there's supposed to be a second phase. It's supposed to go for a preliminary vote before the plenary of the Knesset, probably later this week, and then it has to go through 2 more readings before it becomes law. So for American ears, and I think for most ears in the world, these are all reasonable reforms because the Israeli system as it stands today doesn't have any parallel in the world. So, but the reason why it's caused such an uproar is because, as you see, all of these steps that are on the table would limit the power of the courts. And the reason why limitless power for the courts and for the legal fraternity is so important is because since 1977, when the right first assumed power, when the Likud party under Menachem Begin won the elections for the first time since the founding of Israel in 1948, that victory sort of symbolized or was emblematic of the fact that the old guard Israeli establishment of the Labor Zionist Party had lost the working class. And the minute that they lost the working class, they no longer had the ability to easily win elections and to form governments. So in the intervening years since 1977, particularly beginning in the 1980s and then in high gear in the 1990s, the left was able to retain its power over government policies and over the course of the state of Israel through its control over what you over there call the deep state, and first and foremost through the Supreme Court, and like I said, the legal fraternity led by the Attorney General, the government lawyers, and then David and I have spoken about it in the past as well through the general staff of the IDF and other very high-level echelons of the Israeli permanent bureaucracy and leadership. They've actually maintained their control over Israeli national policies on key issues. First and foremost, for the international audience, would be the Palestinians, but also Iran and other issues related to national security and also things that go on in the country. So by placing limits, checks, and balances on the legal fraternity, this government is actually saying, okay, no, you can't control the course of this country any longer through the permanent bureaucracy. So that's the main reason why the gates of hell have opened up. And so the last thing that I'll say before David takes over is that what we've seen here at home is extremely violent recoil. So you have led by really the leaders of Israeli society. So for instance, you have the head of the top law firm in Israel, a man named David Chodek, who at the annual meeting of the Israel Bar Association called for the use of violence, actually, taking out guns and shooting if the legal reforms pass. And his statement was followed by a statement by a man named Colonel Zev Raz, who was the lead pilot in the Air Force that led the raid on the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq in 1981. He's, considered a hero in Israel. And so he actually called for the assassination of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the ministers in his government if this goes through. You have Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, chief of staff of the army. He has been saying that this government doesn't have any right to exist. It's illegitimate. On Friday afternoon, he posted a photo shop of President Isaac Herzog as Chamberlain holding up the Munich Agreement, and essentially saying Bibi is Hitler, and the president has been trying to have some sort of high-level dialogue to try to reach a compromise between the leaders of the country and the government to avert what they're calling for, which is civil war. And they're openly calling for civil war. Former defense minister and chief of staff of the army, Moshe Ya'alon, former defense minister and chief of staff of the army, Benny Gantz, have been talking about civil war, civil insurrection. Ya'alon today called for a general strike. So all of these people are doing this because we have an expression in Israel to say they're moving their cheese, that they're taking away their extra political, extra democratic control over the major organs of government, and they're firing everybody up. And the final reason that this is happening is because you see a lot of expressions of pure hatred among the Israeli elite for the right wing and all of its constituent parts, the Sephardic working class, the settlers, types, the national religious who live in Judea and Samaria or are very ideologically inclined, the ultra-Orthodox parties. So all of these different groups that comprise the traditional, conservative Likud voters, all of these people are being attacked in the most hateful ways by the left-wing elite. And so that's sort of the climate that we're in. So we have what to outside ears reasonably seem like just like we can't believe that this wasn't already in place in Israel when you talk about the checks that they want to place on the judiciary. And then you see the outcry of our elites here because these limited powers mean that, wait a minute, then the hordes of humanity, which is the majority of Israelis, they get a say. We don't get to continue to control the country. And the last thing I'll say on this, all of these chiefs of staff and people who are screaming the loudest, I mean, Ya'alon, Barak, Yair Golan, another one who was a deputy chief of staff of the army, not all of them ran for Knesset and none of them got elected to Knesset. They didn't even cross the threshold of 4 seats in the Knesset. The public rejected them completely. And here they are calling for rebellion because you have a government in Israel today, and the 6th Netanyahu government, who's actually trying to go forward and carry out their promises of wresting control of the processes of government from the unelected permanent bureaucracy and putting it back in the hands of the people through their elected representatives.
Carolyn, thank you. What a superb overview of the problem. It's really why we wanted to do this briefing is the level of, hysteria that seems now to be being mainstreamed from opposition figures, prominent leaders, former military commanders, and the like. It's just staggering that it seems this could go seriously wrong.
Oh,
A
and two
perilous
last things
threat
I
to
need to,
democracy. Go ahead.
can I just say two last things? So one is, it's not just the military that I've laid out, but also the former president of the Supreme Court, Aaron Barak, who was the one who actually enacted this, what's called a judicial revolution from in 1992, 1995, and through the end of his tenure as Supreme Court president, I think in 2006. So he said that this will be a civil war. He said that it's going to lead to violence. The current standing Supreme Court President Esther Hayut said that if these go forward, then it's going to destroy the judicial system and judicial independence. And again, nobody's talking about taking away their judicial independence. As far as their judgments are concerned, their independence continues on. Just that it's trying to limit their power that they stole from the government and from the legislature to legislate and to govern. So this is not about judicial independence. And finally, the Attorney General, who was appointed by the previous government, has already declared that all of the proposed reforms are illegal. And so we're going to have we're already, just to be clear, we're already in what you would call a constitutional crisis. It's a misnomer in Israel because we don't have a constitution, but be that as it may, about the form of our regime, of our governing system, where you have the judiciary, the state, lawyers, the public service lawyers, and the top echelons of Israel's society, our financial sectors, our legal sectors, our military sectors, etc., are all in open rebellion against the government and the Knesset and the people's representatives. And so we're already in this huge constitutional crisis.
Well, and again, I don't think most Americans have any idea as to how far advanced this crisis is, let alone how dangerous it is. And if I'm not mistaken, Carolyn, there's one other element to what the Attorney General found. He said that the government has an inherent conflict of interest and is not able.
It's a woman, but
Excuse me,
it's a she, right?
is
And
not
she
able
also
to.
has a conflict of interest, right?
Well, needless to say, but that on the basis of that conflict of interest, that the government is illegitimate, as I understand it, and therefore
Right.
should be replaced. This brings us to the role that the United States government is playing in these matters, among others. I think you sort of alluded to it, but our colleague David Wormser, to whom you have also alluded several times, and I not properly introduced, is also with us for the purposes of this briefing. Dr. David Wormser has held senior positions in the United States government. He's a former now naval intelligence officer, achieved the rank of lieutenant commander in the Navy. He has been at the right hand of the Vice President of the United States, the National Security Advisor, and Undersecretary of State, very deeply immersed in the public policies and the internal dynamics within the U.S. government in connection with their formulation. And there's really nobody better in terms of understanding both the complexities of the Middle East and the ways in which the United States government, under successive administrations, has understood them, misunderstood them more often than not, acted, and in some cases acted improperly, it seems to me, in terms of advancing our interests in the region. It's hard to think of a more extreme example of that improper action, that counterproductive action, that really recklessly dangerous action than what the Biden administration has been doing of late, most recently in the persons of both the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and the CIA Director, William Burns, all of whom have made pilgrimages to the Holy Land for the purposes, I think it's fair to say, of weighing in and exercising influence over what's happening with the new government of Israel, specifically with respect to these judicial reforms, to lay out what's been going on and its implications. Again, let us welcome once more Dr. David Wormser to this briefing. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Frank. It's an honor to be here, and thank you, Carolyn, for such a good kickoff. It's a big topic. It's a bit difficult to get a grasp on. So let me give you two statements that were in the last week. One was by President Macron of France, who basically said, not basically, he did say that if Israel proceeds with the reform, France will conclude that Israel is no longer a democracy. That was his statement. Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, his message to Israel was, and it was reinforced by Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, when he visited, and Tom Nides, the American ambassador to Israel, that the foundation of America's support and alliance with Israel, or they didn't say alliance, but relationship with Israel, is its common value of democracy. And that we are watching closely and will judge Israel by its adherence to democracy. And then they go quickly and they pretty much add bluntly that these reforms are questionable in terms of democracy. So you see, France was more blunt, but the policy of the United States and France are the same, which is if Israel wants to put itself in the category of Zimbabwe, or possibly even North Korea, Iran, and so forth. Well, Iran, the United States seems to cut a lot of slack for, but North Korea or China or something like that. If Israel wants to put itself in that moral category, go ahead. But that's the end of American support for Israel, essentially. That's the message coming across. And I think you have to step back and ask why. Why is the United States so determined? Now, clearly, there are some practical questions. They don't like Netanyahu because they're obsessed, quite frankly, with the Palestinian issue and want to move it forward, and don't like hardline governments in Israel, and therefore they want to undercut an hardline government. Second, they clearly want to move toward a deal with Iran eventually, something that really any government in Israel would oppose, but certainly this new government would oppose. So you saw that also linked together in the Anthony Blinken statement. He said, if Israel gives in on the Palestinians, if Israel gives in on these other things, and then most importantly, point number one was, if Israel does not go forward with the reforms or basically neuters the essence of the reforms, only then will the United States support Israel on Iran, which for Israel is an existential threat given the development of potentially of nuclear weapons. So this clearly has become a major element in U.S.-Israel relations. We clearly have signaled our foreign allies to align with that policy and threaten the abandonment of Israel across the board if they go ahead with these reforms. And the question is why? Why are they so determined beyond these? Because this is now at a level that goes beyond these individual questions. We've had these individual questions before, but why now are they going full tilt in a way that could completely sever American-Israeli relations and relegate and quite frankly becomes itself potentially an existential threat to Israel by isolating Israel and going after it from the West? And I think the answer is that what's happening in Israel is not unique to Israel. I think it's an overall battle that is emerging in the overall battle in the West. The legal structure of Israel there's two basic types of legal structures in the world. One is the Anglo-Saxon legal structure, the other is the European legal structure. Those are the two real reference points for what's going on in Israel. And the difference is as follows. The European legal structure starts from a set of lofty values and then allows the European Court of High Justice to essentially legislate according to those values. They don't actually pass laws. but they strike down laws, or they actually create ordinances and other things that are in effect laws to pursue these high values that they have forward. So it's the purpose of the justice system is to pursue a result, specifically an ideological result. And then the legal structure is the instrument to do that, to essentially ensure that such ugly things like populism don't ever really have the power to assert themselves. It essentially removes the will of the people. And that emerges ultimately from the French Revolution and Rousseau, where the idea that there's a social contract, there's a vanguard elite that's smarter than everybody, and that vanguard elite therefore has to be fully empowered. And the legal structure would become very important, if not the most important structure, for this vanguard leader to enlighten his country and execute the will of the people that they themselves are unfamiliar with and not well informed of. So it's a very elitist, ruled by a very small minority elite that thinks they're better than the rest of everybody else. This is, for those of us who study philosophy, this is Plato's philosopher king, which is essentially the foundations of communism, Lenin's thought, and so forth. The Anglo-Saxon legal tradition, and to remind everybody, Israel emerged from the British Mandate, which means British law is precedent in Israel. The formation of its parliament is grounded on the British system. And like the United States, there are foundational laws and principles, not principles, foundational laws that govern the definition of the United States, the definition of Britain, and frankly, the definition of a parliament. And the mother of all laws is the 1689 Bill of Rights, which established the parliament as the voice of the people, the crown, and it was independent, it could act independent, it should act independently of the crown, and it is primus inter pares, it is first among equals. There was no legal branch there, and then even when the United States was created, it did create the legal branch, but it was really a function of almost a negotiated and navigated circumstance. A judicial review is nowhere in our Constitution. It was formed in the Marbury versus Madison case about 20 years later, or 15 years later. So it was really an organic thing that grew out of a very clever and very smart structure. And it understood that the foundation of the Supreme Court's power was credibility. And that gets me to where Israel is. Right now, you've got a judicial system, as I think Carolyn outlined very well, that is increasingly leftist. A small minority, which cannot win elections, has strong alliance with this judicial system. And it's not a judicial system now that's protecting minorities. It's a judicial system that's protecting the rule of the majority by the minority. And a very small minority, an increasingly radical minority at that. So the result of that is that increasingly the Israeli Supreme Court has no credibility in society. It's losing its stature. In the Marbury versus Madison case in 1804, I believe it was, one of the key principles that Marshall, the justice, pursued was the idea that he has no tanks, he has no followers publicly, he has no power for real. His power is credibility, and the court's power is credibility. And that's the essence of the Supreme Court's power in the United States. That is what is lost now by Israel's Supreme Court. The majority of Israelis, even those who didn't vote for this government, there's a number of other parties and parliamentarians who have come out again and again and again with the basic point the Supreme Court is out of control, whether it's Lieberman's party, whether it's Gideon Saar's party, whether it's some people even in the blue and white party like Michal Kotler-Wunsch, whether it's Chaim Ramon, who actually came from the Labor Party and was head of the National Labor Union at one point. You have probably the polls put it around at least 60 to 70% of the Israeli population thinks the court system is out of control and losing altitude in terms of credibility. And so you have really a very grave crisis of the court system, in addition to the constitutional crisis that's emerged. And the reason is because they don't base their foundations in where the American system is based or where the British system is based, from which Israel emerged. They don't base it any. They basically are rejecting the 1689 Bill of Rights and essentially eliminating democracy as the foundational principle, or representative government as the foundational principle of governance, by saying essentially the one thing you have to worry about in government is Hitler. Hitler rising to power through an election, taking over, and being a dictator. So any system that empowers a parliament and actually considers the will of the people to be the governing principle, yes, with minority rights guaranteed through various structures and various laws and various systems, but the very principle of majority rule is what is being rejected here, because the Supreme Court and the left reject majority rule. They don't believe they can ever govern it anymore. So this is their way of staying in power. So what you have is what Carolyn described, I think, really captures it, but you could go on for another hour describing the problems here. There's so much more that has been done to essentially, we've gotten to the point now where a left-wing Israeli government, it's okay because the courts reinforce it. So they can do whatever they want, and the courts are silent. The good example was the gas agreement just before the Israeli elections. Israel ceded sovereign territory. I'm not talking about economic zone, exclusive economic zone territory, the 200-mile or 200-kilometer limit that nations have under the law of sea. I'm talking about the 12-mile territorial limit of a nation's sovereignty. This is sovereign waters. And the Supreme Court was there was a case that was there was a petition to the court to examine that and say, look, this treaty, which is signed with essentially with Hezbollah, Israel's enemy, that gives territory over to Hezbollah's controlled government for economic development. There was actually a gas field there that was given over to Hezbollah to enrich it, essentially. This was never even brought to the parliament for a vote because it wouldn't pass the parliament in a vote. So there was a petition placed to the Supreme Court a month before, it was in October last year, 2022, basically saying, listen, you at least need parliamentary approval when you're going to give up sovereign Israeli territory to an enemy state. And the Supreme Court basically said, no, nobody lives in the water, and therefore there are no representatives of, there's no population. The Knesset, the Parliament of Israel, represents the people of Israel. Since no people live there, the parliament doesn't have skin in this game. The parliament is not relevant here. And it just passed through. So that's a good example of how the left, when it's in power, can pretty much operate without any restraints whatsoever. That's a dictatorship of the majority linked with the tyranny of the judges. When the right is in power, the Israeli government essentially is reduced to an advisory capacity. It doesn't have power, especially the core of it is what Carolyn said, which is the Attorney General's office now works for Aharon Barak in his revolution, gave the Attorney General's office and all the legal bureaus underneath it across the Israeli government veto power over policy. Legal authority over policy. So now, essentially, the government, from the prime minister to the ministers on down, work for the legal advisor. And if she says, I don't like this policy, because she doesn't need to base her judgment on law. It can also be reasonability doctrine, or what in Israel is called bagitz, to Supreme Courticize the issue. All she has to say, the Attorney General, is, Supreme Court won't like this, and it's done. That the policy's dead, cannot be done. This is all subjective, all by a system that is run by people from the left. So a right-leaning government in Israel has absolutely no power now. So that's what this is about. Sorry.
David, let's just open this up to some back
Sure.
and forth between the two of you if we can. Again, you have very impressively laid out the challenge here. I said earlier that I don't think most Americans have any idea of what's going on in Israel. I'm sure they don't have any idea of the degree to which the Biden administration is now engaged in this internal debate inside of Israel and is clearly adding fuel to the fires that are there now. As Carolyn said, I mean, just going over some of these statements, the calls for a general strike, for civil war, for the government that has no right to exist to be dismantled, despite the fact that it just won a significant majority of the popular vote. And not least, explicit calls for the assassination of the Prime Minister of Israel and other ministers if this minority does not get its way. And I guess what I would just put to both of you, because it's been implicit, if not explicit, in what you've said, we hear a lot here in the Biden administration about the death of democracy and how this is an imminent peril to our republic. I can't really think of a more palpable threat to democracy than having this kind of mechanism that the Supreme Court of Israel has manufactured out of whole cloth to negate and effectively, if not literally, cancel popular votes and election mandates. And I guess I would ask both of you, to the extent that we're hearing from the Israeli left as well, that they are defending democracy. How does this work exactly? I mean, by what definition of democracy is what they're doing to, as you said, David, impose the will of a minority on the majority, actually in any way a representative democratic, sort of outcome to elections or government for that matter? David, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think here's where George Orwell comes in Animal Farm. You first take terms and you turn them into their upside down. Democracy is now protecting the country from the will of the people. Rule of law is now become using law to rule arbitrarily by a minority. The separation of powers becomes allowing the judiciary to completely erase the authority of the other branches of government and intervene. I mean, Carolyn can go on with justiciability and all sorts of principles here where they took prerogative to essentially govern other branches of government. So there's no independence anymore to any branch of government other than the judicial branch. So essentially separation of powers became the rule of government by one branch, the judicial branch. So I think what you see here is the inversion of it. And it's important, I think, that everybody in America pays attention to this, because it was only a year ago that we were hearing about court packing schemes and so forth. And we know about the vast institutionalization of what is fairly progressive agenda by a minority crowd in the United States through things like our education system, through cultural institutions, and so forth. They failed to take control. Well, they did for a little bit, but they failed to take control of the judicial branch, which is where the court packing scheme came in here a year ago, which was the attempt to take back the judicial branch, and so forth. But the whole point of all this is what Carolyn got at, which is these are structures that allow a minority to continue to rule when they're rejected by the minority, not to protect a minority to have their views, but to allow a minority to rule when the majority rejects them. And that is what this is all about. And that is why it's strongly likely that Israel is really one of the touchstone battles that is a larger conflict between the left and right and democracies, between which the left is generally beginning to reject democracy and majority rule and trying to impose structures of control because their agenda isn't selling. And I mentioned yesterday, I think, Frank, to you that forcing your daughter to take a shower in a gym with somebody who's cross-dressing and claims to be think of himself as a woman, that this is not a popular opinion in the United States. So they need structures of power to do this. So I think Israel is really now the battleground. And if they bring down the Israeli government, and let's be real, what this is about is laying the groundwork for a judicial coup within a few months. When the bill passes, the Supreme Court will say, it's unreasonable, throws it out. You've got a fundamental showdown between the legislative or the parliament and the Supreme Court. And then you'll have the Mayari, the Attorney General, say that Prime Minister Netanyahu is unfit for office. He should be removed. They already removed one of his ministers for that, and so forth. So I think what you're going to get at is to a judicial coup. And unfortunately, I think the Biden administration sides with the coup because it sees the stakes much larger than Israel. The stakes here are this global conflict between the left and right, with two very fundamentally different visions of how society is organized.
David, I want to come back to that.
Wake up.
Yeah, I want to come back to that specifically in the context of the United States. But Carolyn, back to you. I mentioned there's a lot of talk here about the death of democracy. It's often described in the context, of course, of these domestic terrorists, these extremists, well, in the States, white supremacists is another term that's been thrown about. Insurrection is what they have often been accused of, obviously in the context of January 6th. What you've depicted as the sort of mantra of the radical left now in Israel sounds vastly more insurrectionist than anything that's gone down in the United States to this point, including January 6th. Is there no one, apart presumably from the Netanyahu coalition, who is standing up against this, insurrectionist impulse and calls for violence to boot?
You're asking if there are any responsible adults on the left?
Well, in Israel society, I guess more broadly, is there any support being evidenced for the government and what it's trying to do here?
Well, I mean, a couple of things on that. First of all, you were saying this sounds, the talk of an insurrection, explicit talk of an insurrection, civil war, etc. This is not anything that we've ever seen coming from what's called the far right or the right-wing extremists in Israel. And that's true, but we did see it in the summer of 2020 in the United States, and I think that you have a very clear cross-germination of ideas that goes from the United States to Israel and back in terms of how the left in both countries operate against the majority. And so, for instance, you had Occupy Wall Street, I think it was in like 2010 or something like that, or 2014. And we had the exact same thing. Our Wall Street is Rothschild Boulevard, where we have our Borsa, where we have our stock exchange, and we had occupation of Occupy Rothschild Avenue or Boulevard a couple of years earlier than you had in the United States, and so Israel has been a learning lab for the American left on a whole host of issues. And the kind of democracy that you see, or championing or protection of democracy here on the part of our deep state, is the same as you saw on Twitter with the FBI, CIA takeover of that social media platform ahead of the 2020 elections. And so, it's exactly it's sort of the woke aristocracy against the people, we the people. And so you're seeing that there, you're seeing that here in various ways. You have to add to that two more things. One is the media, and the other one is the legal witch hunt against Netanyahu, which very closely parallels what happened with the Trump and the Russia hoax of his alleged and the false accusations that he and his people were Russian agents in 2016 and since. And so you have these vast parallels between what happened in the United States and what happened here. And I'll just give you an example from Netanyahu's trial over just yesterday, actually. He's been on trial for bribery and breach of trust in Israel for the past 2 years. And the reason why we were in an electoral chaos, and we had 4 successive elections until the radical left government was formed in May of 2021 in a coalition that was dependent on our Muslim Brotherhood party here, because the legal fraternity simply hunted down Netanyahu like an animal. And they concocted crimes that don't exist in the law book that took perfectly legal actions that he had taken that were not at all criminal, and then they, after the fact, said that they were crimes. So they redefined statutes in order to frame Netanyahu as a criminal for actions that he had seemingly taken. So during the course of the past 2 years since his trial opened, all of the charges against him have completely fallen apart. Everything, even the things that we thought he had done, it works out he hadn't done. And just yesterday on the witness stand, the senior investigator, who's I don't know the police ranks, but in English, in Hebrew, it tags with a brigadier general in the police. So it's a second below the top, which is parallel to a lieutenant general. At any rate, so he was in charge of the investigation of Netanyahu, and he acknowledged on the stand that the top echelons of the Justice Ministry, the state prosecution, were attending a meeting where they approved a completely illegal investigation of Netanyahu's, one of his top advisors, where he was extorted into becoming a state witness against Netanyahu. He was arrested and placed in inhumane conditions, denied medical treatment, and then had his family threatened by investigators. And all of this was approved by the senior echelons of the judicial branch, and after the fact, and including using counterterrorism spyware against Netanyahu's closest advisors illegally. So these are things that are just unthinkable. Now, just to give you a sense of how terrible it is, no major newspaper covered this in the newspapers today. This happened yesterday on the witness stand, and Israelis opened up their newspapers in the morning. Yisrael Hayom, Yediot Achronot, Ma'ariv, Jerusalem Post in English, Haaretz, of course. None of them covered this. It's not in the news. Nobody who isn't paying attention knows that he's been proven not only innocent, but the legal fraternity has been proven guilty throughout the course of his trial. So, this is they already ousted a prime minister. They cooked up charges against him. They forced him out of office. And then he's come back now. And they're trying to put checks and balances on this criminal complex, which is the Israeli judicial system and legal system. And they're being threatened with a civil war. So, this is where the parallels are to the United States. So people who have been watching very closely what's happened with the politicization of the FBI, the CIA, and the Justice Department in the United States, all of this sounds really alarmingly familiar. But I've been covering this for years. And by the way, the media just does not want to cover this, and they fire journalists who are covering it. I was fired in June by Israel Hayom. My colleague Gadi Taub was fired a week ago from Haaretz because we were covering this stuff. So, among other things. So they don't want it to be covered either because they're afraid of being the next target, or because they don't want democracy in Israel. They want to block democracy in Israel. And as David said, it's all laundering language, using terms like democracy and the rule of law in order to destroy democracy and transform the rule of law into the rule of unelected, unaccountable lawyers.
Yeah. Carolyn, thank you for that. This is so troubling on so many different levels. And David, I wanted to tie in what you were kind of alluding to that I think is made more compelling in light of what Carolyn has just said. The idea that democracy, if the majority is at odds with the preferences of, in this case, the left, the elite, if you will, the judicial fraternity, it sounds very similar to some of the plans that those in the United States who seek to pack the Supreme Court or otherwise to gerrymander or rig elections so that they can be assured of majorities going forwards, or simply steal them, I guess. And I think this is what you were getting at, David, if I'm not mistaken, is this sort of larger clash between the left and right in Western civilization. Mm-hmm. And I'm reminded of this is sort of out of area for all three of us, I guess, but the Supreme Court of Brazil has undergone a similar kind of evolution and seems to have not only been instrumental in restoring Lula from his status as a convicted felon doing hard time to a candidate for the presidency of Brazil and now the elected president, we're told. This would seem to be a thing, a very dangerous development that we might well find ourselves, if the Biden team has its way, afflicted by as well in this country. Could you just stitch that out a little bit further, David?
Yeah,
I think vital that we understand the fuller implications of all this.
You see the EU structures beginning to mobilize to go after Giorgia Meloni in Italy against the Polish government. They've already gone hard against the Hungarian government, which, I'm not going to get into whether that's good or bad in Hungary, but certainly it's not, we're not talking about China here, or we're not talking about North Korea, and yet they're demonized and isolated in the court structures in Europe, are active to try to do that. So you see basically and I think Carolyn put it good, it's a woke aristocracy. And it may not be everybody on the left. There's a lot of fellow travelers who are liberal, and they want to, and they're being swept along with this, just like not everybody in the United States left is woke left. But the point is, they are the center of gravity right now of the activity of the left. They define the left, and the larger left is unable to control that at this point. So this woke aristocracy does not believe in democracy. And I think what you're seeing is this global sort of temper tantrum and hysteria, because deep down, they realize that what they're advocating is rejected. The high watermark of popular support for some of this, some of these ideological principles is being reached. Now, I don't know, the education system is a radical factor what's being done to the youth, and going back to Animal Farm, first you make everybody ignorant, and then you can define words any way you want. That perhaps is what's going on, and we should pay very close attention to our educational structures, because that'll be the next issue beyond the courts. That will be the big battleground, probably, is to begin to reintroduce traditional values, and by that I don't mean necessarily religious values. I'm talking about traditional American values and traditional Israeli values into the school systems are going to be met with a similar sort of hysterical, but then it all boils down to the court structures and these power structures that the left has worked very hard for 20, 30 years to take control of. And it's quite a big challenge right now. This is not the game for the right in Israel and here, after Oslo, after the unilateral withdrawals, and here when we lose elections, is, well, we got to do a better job. We got to figure out how we're going to convince the American people. We've got to somehow win the American people and bring them back to our side. And what the left is doing is leapfrogging that. And they're saying, it doesn't matter anymore. You can win the majority. We're going to make that irrelevant. The game can't be won that way anymore. And so we have a lot of catching up to do to understand this structure of institutionalization that essentially ends the democratic verdict that could reverse all this.
Yeah. I think over time a little bit, but Carolyn, I did just want to ask one more question to you, as someone who hails originally from this country, as well as has now lived for many years in Israel and loves, I think, both nations profoundly. The serious problem that I think we're all somewhat ignoring is that we are, Israel specifically is in a part of the world where you don't need to create impressions of opportunities to take on Israel to cause people to feel they'd be inclined to do that, which means that if the United States government at the moment is conducting itself in a manner that is actually not only injecting itself into the internal affairs of a friendly democratic state, but actually intensifying dangers to that state, it really further reinforces a concern that I think our team at the Center for Security Policy has, that this is not just misbegotten. This is not just inappropriate. This is positively reckless and can redound to the detriment not only of the people most immediately involved, of course, the Israeli people who stand to be disenfranchised by all of this, but also, the Jewish state writ large and our own. Would you care to comment quickly on that?
Well, we are in a we're in a very threatened position. The United States, we can talk about another webinar. I'd be happy to join. Is also actively pursuing or abiding by the constraints of the Iran nuclear deal from 2015. Just yesterday, the Washington Free Beacon reported that the United States is maintaining its waivers on Russia and Iran conducting, developing nuclear energy together. This is, the United States is living within the JCPOA parameters, even though Iran is not agreeing to any of the limitations the JCPOA placed on its nuclear weapons program. So this isn't the only place that the Biden administration is adopting a policy that's very hostile to Israel and undermines its national well-being. I mean, we could add to that their policies that are very, very obsessive compulsive in siding with the Palestinians against the Israelis, even as the Palestinians are inciting and indoctrinating their children to be terrorists and to actually kill Israelis in massacres like the one that we saw a week ago outside of a synagogue in Jerusalem on the eve of the Sabbath. So, I mean, we have a lot of active theaters of war that are being carried out now, and adding this kind of internal chaos very much is a problem. And it's a sort of thing that you could expect the United States, whether in relation to the Iranian revolutionaries on the ground trying to overthrow the regime, which threatens us all, and or whether it's in regards to Israeli democracy, that if the United States isn't going to be standing with the good guys, then at least it could just be quiet and not be intervening actively on behalf of the bad guys. But what we're seeing with the Biden administration is that, in fact, the United States is putting its thumbs on the scales on behalf of the people in Iran who are the Ayatollahs, and are placing their thumb on the scales in relation to Israel on behalf of the people who are calling for civil war and for the dismantling of what's left of Israel's democratic structures. So, yes, the United States is acting in a very reactionary way right now, and is undermining the forces of freedom and democracy abroad among its allies, whether the allies are the Iranian people who want to overthrow the Ayatollah regime, or whether it's the people of Israel who love the United States probably more than any single people on the face of the planet outside of the United States. So yeah, I mean, this is very reckless. It's very hostile, and
Yes.
and it should be a concern also, I think, for Americans who care about not only Israel, but America's place in the world. And, is the United States, you don't have to go around slaying dragons all the time and being the great, the great knight on a white horse. But, if you don't want to advance certain concepts of morality, then at least don't advance concepts of immorality,
Well said. Thank you to you both. I'm so proud of this part of our Center for Security Policy Middle East team. The work that you all are doing through these webinars, and we will probably have another one on this subject soon with some others who have also been expressing concerns about what's afoot. But through your various articles and papers and television programs and podcasts and other really important contributions to the public policy debate are, I think, raising the kinds of issues that we must attend to. We could find ourselves in very short order discovering that a terrible, terrible loss has been suffered by one of our most, if not the most important ally we have, certainly in the Middle East, namely the state of Israel, if it becomes embroiled in this kind of fratricidal bloodletting that some on the left seem to be intent upon bringing about. Our own government has its problems, and many of them we're seeing very close at hand here at home. But what it is doing abroad, in particular in this case, that, as you've taught me, Carolyn Glick, is a prime example of treating your friends worse than you treat your enemies, which, as you've pointed out, is a formula for having very few friends and probably a lot of enemies.
And very many enemies.
And a lot of enemies, and we can't afford that, needless to say. Carolyn Glick, thank you for your great work. David Wormser, as well, to you, and for joining us for this really important conversation. I hope that our audience will take advantage of the opportunity to pass this webinar around widely when it is posted in the very near future at securefreedom.org. In the meantime, thank you for tuning in, those of you who are with us now, and to those of you who will be watching soon, please check out securefreedom.org. It's a marvelous resource on these subjects and much, much more. And we would appreciate your support for the work we do at the Center for Security Policy. Till next time, this is Frank Gaffney. Thanks so much for joining us.